Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into a rigorous but honestly highly rewarding quest, installing the ultimate digital fortress on your computer. Today, we're walking through the exact steps for a first-time installation of Qubes OS. But before we get into the technical weeds of hypervisors and cryptography, well, we need to start with a serious reality check. Right out of the gate, we've got to manage our expectations here. As one veteran user clearly put it on the Qubes Reddit community, if you're a gamer or if you expect a perfectly simple, always easy to use system, Qubes is absolutely not for you. So Qubes requires some serious preparation, a willingness to learn, and yeah, giving up a few conveniences. But the payoff? It's unparalleled digital security that literally compartmentalizes your entire digital life. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll figure out if Qubes is right for you, cover the hardware and prep work, verify your download, boot up the installer, and finally tackle the actual installation and configuration. Let's kick things off with Section 1. Is Qubes for you? To really answer that, we have to look under the hood and understand why the hardware requirements are so notoriously strict. Qubes isn't just another Linux distro. It uses a bare metal Xen hypervisor that sits right above the physical hardware. Its entire purpose is to strictly isolate everything into separate domains. We're talking about your networking, your storage, your applications, all kept in distinct, secure vaults. Because it manages your hardware directly to enforce this isolation, nested virtualization, like trying to run it inside VirtualBox or VMware, is completely unsupported. You've got to install this directly on the metal. That brings us to Section 2, hardware and prep work. Let's tackle our first major trial, making sure your computer is actually capable of running this highly unique setup. You'll need a bare minimum of 6 GB of RAM and 32 GB of storage just to get the installer running. But the absolute non-negotiable requirement here is your processor. You must have a 64-bit CPU equipped with hardware virtualization features. So for Intel, that means VTX and VTD. For AMD, you're looking for AMD-V and AMD-VI. Without these specific hardware extensions, Qubes physically cannot build the isolated compartments it needs to function. Now, here's a pro tip for you. If you boot up the installer and get hit with that dreaded, unsupported hardware detected error, do not panic. It usually just means you need to restart, dive into your computer's BIOS or UEFI settings, and manually activate IOMMU. Often, it's just hiding under an advanced or security tab. Without this activated, Qubes just won't be able to enforce that strict isolation for your network and USB hardware. All right, moving right along to Section 3, verifying your download. This involves checking cryptographic seals, which is easily the most critical and, for a lot of folks, the most unique phase of a Qubes install. See, simply downloading the ISO file isn't enough. We have to ensure it absolutely hasn't been tampered with. To understand how this works, we need to talk about the QMSK. That's the Qubes Master Signing Key. Since Qubes operates on the assumption that the internet is inherently untrustworthy, you can't just blindly trust a download link. The QMSK is the ultimate root of trust for the entire project, and the private portion of this key is kept locked away on a dedicated, offline, air-gapped vault machine. So before we verify our download, we have to use OpenPGP software to fetch and authenticate this exact master key. Let's see how this builds into a secure verification sequence. It's a literal chain of trust. First, you get the master signing key and verify its fingerprint through multiple different channels, like checking various websites, videos, or mailing lists. Once you're confident in that master key, you use it to authenticate the release signing key for your specific version of Qubes. And finally, you use that trusted release signing key to verify the detached PGP signature of the actual ISO file you just downloaded. When you run that final GPG command in your terminal, there's a specific output you're looking for. When your terminal outputs exactly good signature from Qubes OS Release X signing key, you've successfully conquered the cryptography trial. At that point, you can confidently trust that your ISO file hasn't been intercepted or tampered with maliciously on its way to your computer. With a verified ISO in hand, it's time to create your USB installation medium. But please, pay close attention here because a wrong move can easily wipe your existing data, and Qubes won't be there to save you from yourself. If you're on Linux, use the DD command and make absolute sure you're targeting the entire USB device, not your primary hard drive. If you're on Windows, you can use the Rufus tool, but you absolutely must select Write in DD image mode after pressing Start. Seriously, if you don't use DD mode, the installer is just going to fail to boot properly. Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, booting the installer. We need to tackle the BIOS and UEFI configuration. With our verified, properly formatted USB drive created, we face the next hurdle: getting your computer to actually boot from it instead of your normal operating system. So, how do we get to the boot menu and configure the BIOS to accept Qubes? To begin, power off your computer, plug in the USB, and right after pressing the power button, you'll need to furiously mash a specific key, commonly Escape, F10, or Delete, depending on who made your computer. That gets you into the low-level firmware, but once you're in there, what actually needs to change? Once you're inside the firmware, you have to make a few crucial tweaks. First, if you're on a modern UEFI system, you must completely disable Secure Boot, or Qubes simply won't be allowed to load. Second, double-check that all those virtualization extensions we talked about earlier are actually activated. And finally, go to the boot menu and move your USB drive up to the very top of the boot priority list. Save those changes, reboot, and the Qubes Anaconda installer should pop right up. And welcome to Section 5, Installation and Configuration. Once you pass the initial boot screen and compatibility checks, you'll boot right into the Anaconda graphical interface. You're in the home stretch now, and remarkably, this installer runs entirely offline. It doesn't even load networking drivers, completely preventing any internet-based data leaks during setup. The interface will look pretty familiar to anyone who's used Fedora before. You'll breeze right through localizing your keyboard and time zone. Then select a destination drive. Remember, it needs at least 32 gigs of free space, and it can't be the same USB drive you're installing from. By default, Qubes is going to encrypt everything using LUKS, so you'll be prompted to set a complex disk encryption passphrase that you must never, ever forget. Seriously. Finally, just create a single local user account for yourself. After the installation finishes, you'll reboot, enter that new encryption passphrase, and the initial setup wizard takes over. This is where the magic really happens. Qubes automatically compartmentalizes your digital life by creating starter app VMs like Personal, Work, and a completely offline vault. It also spins up isolated service cubes like SysNet to handle your networking and SysUSB to safely quarantine all your untrusted USB controllers. This setup leads to your ultimate reward at the end of this quest. Even though all these applications are running in entirely separate, strictly isolated virtual machines, the Qubes secure GUI subsystem integrates them seamlessly. You get a unified XFCE desktop environment where your securely compartmentalized apps run side by side. You can easily tell them apart by the brightly colored borders Qubes paints around their windows, ensuring, for example, that your personal browser doesn't accidentally compromise your sensitive work documents. It's brilliant. So, you've successfully navigated the hardware checks, the cryptographic signatures, and the BIOS tweaks to complete the rigorous quest of installing Qubes OS. Your completely compartmentalized digital fortress is now fully active. So I'll leave you with this thought. With this immense power of isolation now right at your fingertips, what highly sensitive task will you secure in your very first app VM? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and enjoy exploring your brand new, incredibly secure environment.